So welcome to the Doppelgangers and Timewarps pop culture panel. This is kind of a yearly thing. This is like our
Third year.
Third year, going strong. So we're each going to talk about various movies, TV shows that kind of fit into this. But before we get started, let me introduce our panelists. So on the left is Lisa Pavia-Hegel, Associate Professor of Communications and Theater. Then we have Dr. Tim Bean, enthusiastic person. Dr. Tim Bean, Professor of English, and I'm Joe Colburn, the Emerging Technologies Librarian here at the library. So what we're going to do is we're each going to do like a brief statement at the beginning, I guess, like 5 minutes, and then we're going to kind of talk about the pop culture implications for these things. So I'm going to hand it right over to Tim.
All right, so I'm going to start off with a little line that I heard watching a Stephen King miniseries from back in the day. It was called Storm of the Century, and there was this bad guy. His name was Lenoge, and it was an anagram for Legion, so he was the devil. And he would say, hell is all about repetition. And I thought, I have a friend who's like, I'm tired of hearing the same songs every time I go to the gas station, or tired of seeing this kind of trope done over and over again on a TV show or movies. But really, if we didn't have repetition, what would so many TV shows and movies be? Does anybody watch The Walking Dead and say, oh, they're killing zombies again? I mean, when are they going to stop with this? Or they don't watch Game of Thrones and they've said the line, winter is coming way too many times. It's like, no, there's something about repetition that we either like or we've been conditioned to like. And then we even have this weird phenomena of a kind of subgenre where repetition is the main focus, and the most famous, or maybe the best example of that, is Groundhog Day. And we have Bill Murray here driving with a groundhog, right? And that's when, so the premise here of the Groundhog Day or the movie or the loop narrative, and again, it's only called that because this movie is so famous, Groundhog Day movie, is that, Phil, character in the movie, he keeps reliving Groundhog Day over and over again. He's stuck in the town where they actually do the Groundhog Day ceremony, so they have this famous, Puxatawny Phil or whatever. And at one point, and so he keeps reliving it. He goes to bed, wakes up, it's always February 2nd. And this gets a little depressing after a while. At one point, he concludes the way to break out of this loop is I got to kill the groundhog. And he decides, why not? I'll drive off a cliff with the groundhog. It's that absurd. But the key thing about it's never explained why he's reliving this day over and over again. But clearly, he has to become a better person by the end of the movie to break out of it, and that's just what happens. He becomes a much better person, and finally he's allowed to. No wave of a hand from an angel. It's February 3rd. Another example of somebody who's sort of a bad person to start with. There's a movie called Before I Fell. Groundhog Day was '93. This is 2017, so it's 2 years ago. In this case, Groundhog Day played sometimes seriously, but a lot of times as a comedy for laughs. This one, it's pretty much, there's a few chuckles, but it's pretty serious throughout, because in this case, we have really a group of mean girls, and one of them, and they all die in a car wreck, spoiler alert, at the end of the day, but one of the mean girls keeps reliving that day, and even if she finds a way for them to avoid the car wreck, there's still this other tragedy that happens where one of the girls that they bullied ends up killing herself. So pretty sobering stuff, but again, there's this narrative of the time loop as a way for her to improve herself, and ultimately we see it's a way for her to save the life of this person who commits suicide. So both these time loop narratives are very about, we can get better if there's something we change about, maybe many things we change about our lives. A third example that's much darker, and so it's my favorite, is Triangle, and it's from 2009, and my film appreciation students had to suffer through my long lecture on this, but we have three real, and like I said, the Groundhog Day in some way has inspired probably, I would say, as many as 25 or more stories from Buffy, Angel, or I don't know if Angel did it, X-Files did it, any kind of little sci-fi fantasy show. Star Trek did it in 2 different shows. So in all these, they usually come out of it okay, right? I mean, they find, the rest of the show is not just stuck in a time loop, let's put it that way. In Triangle, though, they have, like I said, 3 significant deviations from the formula. One, we realize at a certain point, this character, Jess, multiple mirror person here, she's been through this many times before the movie ever began. Like, we didn't get to see the first time this happened to her. And the second big, and the reason we know this is the second big deviation is that it is not a clean, like, starting of the timeline. I call it a reboot. There's not a clean reboot each time. And the timelines can kind of blend over. Like, there's different versions of Jess on the ship at the same time. There's like a version of her, there's a killer. There's one that's like running away from the killer. At one point she finds a friend of hers who's dying, who's been shot, and she's kind of bleeding to death, except there's like 15 other copies of the woman. It's really freaky scene. So that, like I said, that really, all the other time loop narratives, everything, the day starts over and everything's the same. But in this case, it's not even a full day. It's an hour or 2 at most. And when it reboots, like I said, bleeding over of different timelines. And the third thing we saw before those other 2 movies, it was sort of like good people or bad people becoming good. The tragedy of Triangle is that we think we have a heroic mother in our character Jess, but it turns out it's more like the Pogo cartoon, famous Pogo cartoon. We have met the enemy, and he is us. In fact, we learn by the end of the movie that she's abusive to her autistic son, and she accidentally gets him killed. And it's just, like I said, it's really grim. And the final kind of gut punch is that it seems like this loop is going to go on forever and ever, but I cannot, so I'll stop.
Nice. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple movies. I'm going to talk a little bit about time loops and about doppelgangers, and all of this, I have to admit, is framed in the context of the Bill and Ted movies. These all came out in like the, late 80s, early 90s, so this was before I would say all of you were probably born, but we're going to go with it. So, okay, so this is kind of washed out. This is the second Back to the Future movie, and I've noticed as I sort of started considering all these time travel movies that there seem to be a couple emergent themes. There seems to be this theme of like moral and ethical imperatives like Tim's talking about, and then there also seems to be this kind of agnostic theme that's just about science, and it's kind of nihilistic, and it's kind of like you have to do what you have to do, but the world's going to go on anyway. This movie in particular, and actually all the Back to the Future movies, they're on a linear, there's like one timeline, and you can leave that timeline and go back and change that single timeline, but there's always only one trajectory, right? So if we look at, you can barely see this. This is Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which came out in 1981. It's directed by Stephen Herrick. So this is another kind of utopian tale where the whole point is these 2 guys, it's young Keanu Reeves and Alex Winter, who was in like Lost Boys and nothing else. I don't think he's been in anything else. But so the idea is that they're these 2 teenagers and they have to write a history report, and they're going to fail out of school, but it turns out that if they fail out of school, the world's going to eventually fall into a dystopia. And so this guy from the future goes back in time so they can, and helps them finish their history report. And they do that by going back in time and collecting historical figures. So you have Genghis Khan on the left, Abraham Lincoln on the right. There seems to be very little consequence to bringing these people forward in time, other than Bill and Ted can pass their report. It's really very weird. You could argue it's kind of a lazy premise. Maybe it is.
But it's funny. It's
funny, right? And it's also very like solipsistic. Like the whole thing is just about Bill and Ted. They're like the chosen ones, so anything they do is fine. And then that kind of feeds into, in some ways, this show Russian Doll, which you may be more familiar with. So this is Natasha Lyonne, who plays this character Nadia. So it's her and this guy named Alan, and they're 2 people who are stuck in these time loops Tim's talking about. And it's the same thing like in Groundhog Day, where they're trying to figure out how to get out of the time loop, and they try all these different things, they die a whole bunch of times. It doesn't really seem totally obvious like what they're supposed to be doing. Nadia's character is kind of the secular, theoretical physicist kind of person. She's not really, but that's how she talks about what they need to do to get out. And then the Alan character is kind of like the ethical, moral person who says, we must have done something wrong. There's a lot of weird motifs in here. Like you can see that orange she's holding in the show, as you go through the episodes, the longer they're stuck in a time loop, you'll see like the fruit is rotting in the show. But then at one point, Nadia takes the fruit and cuts it open, and you can see that it's rotten on the outside, and on the inside, it's fresh. And so it's a play on this idea of memento mori, which is remember that you will die one day. It's kind of like I don't know, it goes back to classical antiquity, but it's all more like a medieval sort of thing, I guess. And so, that's just about like rotting fruit, your own mortality. But when she cuts this open and it's fresh, it suggests that it doesn't really matter. Like if in this timeline we die, in another timeline we're riding horses on the beach or something. And then that kind of feeds into, what happens at the end of this is that she starts seeing her own doppelganger, a younger version of herself. And the doppelganger has all kinds of implications that we'll get into later when we start answering some of those questions. But I don't know, did anyone see Us? It's a Jordan Peele movie. It's a freaky movie, but the premise of this movie is it's interesting because it's like almost like a purely ethical thing. So what's happening is there's like all of us living in the world now, and there's this whole like secret underclass of people who are doppelgangers. And what happens is this little girl manages to well, I'm going to spoil the whole movie if I say what. But basically, like, this little girl encounters her own doppelganger, and she has to kind of come to terms with what the ethical implications of having this whole subclass of people is. And so a lot of times I think doppelgangers, for that reason, are kind of, they're a mirror that we're holding to ourselves.
So. There's copies of ourselves.
Yeah, and then that's also happens in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. I'm just going to throw that out there. Where they encounter like clones of themselves from the future, and they have to make robot versions of themselves to fight the clones of themselves. It gets very off into the weeds. But I'll just hand it over to Elise and let her talk about her stuff.
I like when they give me power over the remote control. So I decided to take one show and do a deep dive. Now the nice thing is that the show I picked is a very deep well, and that's Star Trek. And I would try to give you guys as much, because I'm sure everybody in the room has probably seen different Treks, if you've seen any Trek at all. But the reason that I wanted to pick it is because we're talking about like moral and ethical implications. Star Trek has always been seen as more than a television show, because they've always dealt with these really deep kind of ethical things, and I'll talk more about that when I start talking about the shows. But I wanted to talk about how Star Trek deals with the idea of a multiverse. Multiverses and multiple universes have been part of popular culture since the golden age of science fiction. And Man in the High Castle was actually published in 1962, I think. And 1962, which talked about an alternate timeline where the Nazis won World War II and occupied part of the United States, and then the Japanese occupied the other part. And it's actually an Amazon show, so you can kind of see that brought to life. But then the multiverse, so the idea basically is that every choice that we have creates a different universe of causality. And we've seen this if you've seen Into the Spider-Verse. Into the Spider-Verse played with multiple universes as well. In that, for example, instead of Peter Parker being bit by a radioactive spider, Gwen Stacy is, and she becomes Spider-Gwen. And so there's all these other kind of implications. And then also, if you've seen any of the CW shows, The Flash, Arrow, and Marvel does it as well. Now, so why does pop culture love a multiverse? Well, first of all, it helps clean up a lot of inconsistencies if you have multiple franchises. How do you handle the fact that in a comic book a character is dead, but in the movie they're alive? Well, it's a different universe. And in a lot of ways, Star Trek has done this. Because they've had shows that have been going on since the early 60s. So it makes sense that they would have like, oh, well, that happens in a different universe, so it's okay. But there's some other implications here that I think are kind of cool to look at.